Marvelous. Right, so as you hopefully heard, we are now recording, so welcome everyone to our weekly call, either remotely or in person, in the new hybrid format, which is sort of groundbreaking. Right, let me share my screen to just remind us of what we're going to talk about this week. So unsurprisingly, the main focus of the discussion is going to be on some of the highlights from the IETF and OARC meetings that have taken place over the last 7 days. So for those of us that have certainly been present in person, been quite intense 7 days with a lot of very good content, to be fair. So we'll just sort of give some sort of highlights from that, signpost things to for people to take a look at if you haven't had a chance to catch up with them yet. And I'm hoping that this is going to be somewhat interactive, because it'd be really boring if it's just me sort of sharing some highlights. So hopefully some other people that were at the various events will sort of kick in as we go along. So in terms of structure, I thought we'd start with the most recent event, OARC, whilst it's fresh in people's minds, then go back through some of the highlights from IETF, and then I just put out some of the sort of the recent news, forthcoming events, etc., just to walk through a few things from there. But let's firstly start. I've put up what I shared 2 weeks ago, just for a bit of consistency, in terms of some of the sessions that I sort of highlighted that were on the meeting agenda for OARC over the weekend. I'll give some comments on some of those, and then Peter and Brett and others, Andreas, I think others who attended, feel free to sort of join in and either add stuff or correct me if you think I've got something wrong, and also anything that perhaps I haven't included on here, any of the other sessions you think were worth mentioning, please do those as well. But in the order that they're listed, Andrei Meshkov talked about AdGuard's experiences with the sort of DOQ in general, and specifically with the DOQ resolver, effectively reprising but updating the presentation that he ran through on this call, I think a couple of months ago, perhaps, something like that. But bringing it completely up to date. I don't recall there being any significant differences in terms of the sort of the substance of the presentation, but it was, although it's good just to hear that, you know, just reinforcing some of the sort of the experience that AdGuard has gained, and I didn't pick up on anything. So any new concerns that Andrei highlighted in terms of their sort of learnings. So I think it all remains, from their perspective, very positive in terms of the benefits of DOQ versus don't, certainly. No significant downsides that I recall, unless anyone can think of anything different to that.
No, it was. I thought it was good. It was the coverage in general throughout the whole weekend was really good.
Yeah. Then we had a presentation on the use of DOQ on authoritatives, which was actually pretty interesting. It's one of the guys at CZNIC. So I've asked him if he would like to join this call to sort of reprise that presentation. So it was quite interesting. Yeah, basically underlining the fact that sort of DNS OARC is beginning to be used somewhat more widely, which is I think quite encouraging. And the other one from the Saturday worth highlighting, certainly for me, was in the afternoon. We had a presentation on the use of or the impact of the use of DNSSEC in terms of its overhead by various measures. And I think the surprising conclusion was that actually there was very little impact. I think it was just on memory load, if I remember rightly, was the only noticeable effect.
And that was only about 10%.
Yes.
You know, memory's cheap. So
yeah, so I for one was surprised at that the overhead didn't seem to be especially troubling. Given that I know there've been various concerns raised by people about the impact of its use. I appreciate that the overhead in terms of system resources is not the only concern, but hopefully that does at least remove one concern from consideration.
Although there was one talk later on that talks about the amount of bandwidth that was used with DNSSEC on, I think it was an authoritative server. And that was really interesting because there was significant but reasonable, like doable increases. So yeah, that was just a counterpoint.
Yeah, yeah. Again, anyone that attended want to chip in with anything else that you picked up from either any of those sessions on the Saturday, or indeed anything else in terms of highlights from the Saturday at OARC?
I think it's my echo. Horrible noise. I think there were a few other talks, Andrew, that I thought were really interesting. Whether they're fully interesting in the scope of this meeting, because they weren't necessarily encrypted DNS related, but if you know there are other people who are interested in DNS in general, and certainly operators of DNS, there were some particular ones I thought were very interesting. I'm trying to think what they were now. A guy from Google gave a really interesting presentation about preventative measures to avoid DNS cache poisoning, which I thought was particularly useful. There was a great, as always, there was a great presentation from Jeff Houston on resolvers and what types of resolvers being used. But I think that was a rehash of something he'd done for us before anyway.
Oh no, that was on the Sunday. Completely, that was interesting. So hang fire on that one. I'll come on to that in a second.
Okay. And then a couple of others very quickly. There was a guy from NS1 that gave a really interesting talk on a tool for processing small data at the edge for DNS and network monitoring tool, which certainly is something that I'll be investigating. And then the very, I think it was might have been the last talk of the day for anybody who's interested in DANE and doesn't really know what it is. It was a great introductory talk on DANE that Schumann gave at the end of the day.
Yeah,
and those are my highlights.
Yeah, and they're all good. So
yeah, the Google DNSSEC validation talk was really interesting for me as well. Like, I found it fascinating that they do capitalization randomization, as a preventative measure to prevent cache poisoning, because you match the capitalization that's being sent and received. And I thought it's kind of a simple but like must be really effective thing. Also made me want to learn a lot more about DNS cookies, which I have to confess is something that I'm a bit weak on. I need to look into that much more.
Yeah, and then segueing sort of very neatly into the Sunday from sort of Brett's mention of Jeff's presentation on the resolvers that we use. In fact, that was largely because the presentation he'd originally proposed giving was on resolveless DNS, but for whatever reason that wasn't of interest to the program committee. So instead, he gave a presentation basically analysing the data to really look at what the market share, if you like, my retitling of it to try and explain it in a sentence, well, market share of different resolvers in Europe. It was sort of the question that he was posing was from the perspective of, is DNS for EU needed to counter the sort of dominant market share of Google's DNS resolver? And the conclusion, so spoiler alert, watch Jeff's presentation because there's a lot more depth than I'm going to give it now. But spoiler alert is that actually, when you sort of properly analyze Google's market share in a meaningful way, it's maybe not as high as people would believe. And actually, by far and away, the biggest market share collectively is spread between the sort of major ISPs in Europe, which collectively far outweigh the market share of the open public resolvers. Albeit if you unpack the data more and look at what visibility of DNS data the likes of Google get, it's much higher than their market share in terms of which of those queries they're actually servicing as the resolver. So you can interpret the data differently, but as always, Jeff gave a very good and detailed sort of explanation of the stats, underpinned by much of the really sort of first-class data that the APNIC team have through their, I think he said it's 20 million queries they push out a day. So I think they've probably got unparalleled data to share on that.
I thought the technique that they used to measure it was kind of fascinating as well. They ran ads which had a unique host name in them, and then they were able to, so it's a single-use host name that they were able to track back to a query, and then they could see where the query was coming from. And one of the things that they found was that these single-use host names were repeated by sometimes several hours or days later. And he mentioned one case where there was like 100 different resolvers had queried for the same host name. So there's some piece of software somewhere which is sending out a DNS request, and then it's checking another resolver and another resolver and 100 other resolvers just to see whether, I don't know why it's doing it, but kind of weird that,
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that whole thing just underlines the fact that DNS is weird, right?
Yes, who knew?
That's what makes it interesting to work in.
Yes.
One thing about Jeff's talk that I was wondering about is when he isolated the traffic from consumers. So First, he started with the all-over traffic, and then he reduced everything that is related to consumers. And he phrased it like they don't press the button, so they don't change their stuff. They just use their phone or their home devices as they are. And this was quite surprising because in many cases they just use the internet via their browser. It's not like that they do a lot of other stuff. And with all these browsers out there with this pre-installed DOH, I was wondering why the number was lower. So the overall was something like 16% for Google, and when he reduced it to customers or end customers, it was something like 4% or something like that. I would expect a higher number because in an enterprise, they control the devices. They can force policies to ensure that the browser is definitely just using the on-premise DNS, compared to whatever the people have at home. When they don't change anything, they just use what the browser is offering. And so I was just curious, why is the number lower when we just isolate end users compared to the overall?
Isn't that because most browsers don't make any changes to the defaults? I'm thinking about on home systems primarily for this, to be clear, Andreas. So certainly Chrome and Edge, Google and Windows and Microsoft don't change the user settings unless the user makes a change. As we know, famously, Mozilla did go down the path of changing to initially to Cloudflare by default, yep. But although it's got more options than just Cloudflare now, but not in Europe. If you recall, they didn't.
Oh yeah, you're right. So his entire measurement was focused on Europe, right?
It was indeed, yeah, yes, it's a fair point. Were he to do it in North America, I think you get different answers.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
As a quick thought to that, is it different on mobile and desktop maybe? Like, I think we're all talking about this, thinking about desktop browsers, but a lot of people, their main device for consuming the internet is a mobile phone or a tablet these days.
Well, I think the presentation that Jeff gave yesterday didn't differentiate by device, to be honest. So he was giving the consolidated data, and I've frankly no idea whether APNet can do any differentiation. Whether they look at what the sort of the browser was, or other client software. And in my experience, they tend to do a lot more analysis of this sort of stuff than anybody else, at least that they share publicly.
Sure. I'm imagining that obviously with Android, it will do DOT by default, I think, automatically. So you're going to see a much higher percentage there. But I don't think any of the mobile stacks do DOH like automatically yet. I might not be informed.
And even though it does dot by default, I think on Android, I don't know that it changes the actual resolver provider.
Correct. It'll use whichever provider you've got it set to. But
yeah, and that's what he was looking at for this particular analysis. It wasn't looking whether it was encrypted or not. He was looking at who the serving resolver was. Maybe that's a question that next time Jeff Post joins us, he always has a huge raft of data, so that's maybe one worth asking the next time he's on. I'll just move on to cover a couple of others quickly. There was then a very shallow presentation by some bloke who you'd never heard of, talking about bizarre and unusual uses of DNS, which, more seriously, Peter reprised his presentation from last Christmas, but updated it somewhat with some fresh references to other odd things that people use DNS for.
I have to say, it was.
I mean, to be fair, his presentation wasn't as shallow as mine because mine didn't even get mentioned.
It was very strange giving a presentation to a room full of people with masks on, and not being able to see any kind of reaction from everybody was a bit odd. And I had some.
It was even stranger doing it remotely, where I had absolutely no feedback whatsoever.
Yeah, Brett's was actually really good, by the way. I have to say, it was really interesting, and I think he's an excellent speaker as well.
You know what was the most funniest part of your presentation? The comment at the end where somebody asked, "Why the hell have you done that?"
There was some pushback about my comments about Bimmy as well. Apparently, there are some people who are proponents of Bimmy, and I may have offended one or two people. So apologies to anybody who feels the same.
Yeah, and Brett does remind me that the OARC suffered from some technical glitches, so it wasn't exactly seamless integration between the on-site and remote participants, so you couldn't do Q&A properly and think other than via the chat, which made things a little stilted. I'm not sure what the underlying problem was, but it just wasn't working terribly well, which made it, I think, really hard for remote presenters in particular, because as you say, Brett, is just not, you would have been completely presenting to an empty room almost, which would be very odd.
Yeah,
I think the underlying problem was it was the first time they'd done it in a fashion where the chair of the session was in the room, and there was remote presenters and local presenters, and they just hadn't really thought about that.
Yeah, they were fixing a lot of stuff in the background, like in real time as well.
Yeah. Other things well, actually, the other one, probably just in the interest of time, I'll highlight was was the zero knowledge middle box presentation, which we had. You'll recall Paul gave a presentation for a few weeks ago now, and he reprised and updated that. And it's looking, my read of it is, it's looking like he has a viable solution that could be implemented in software, in actual sort of working software in the world, if you like, rather than just in the labs. It's certainly getting very close to that point where it could be used in anger. So just as a reminder, again, very simple summary of the concept. So you could have middle boxes that are able to ensure conformance with sort of network policies without needing to see the content of the messages. And doing that in a sort of in a trustworthy way. They're continuing to work on the testing, and it feels like they've made a lot of pretty solid progress now with that. So I suspect that in fact, I think he even mentioned in the presentation that they are talking to at least one vendor to potentially use their techniques and embed it into some applications now, which is quite encouraging, as that will be a good solution to avoiding some of the downsides of encryption without having to impinge on privacy in any way. So that's just some comment on those that we'd highlighted before the event, but feel free for any of you that attended for anything else you want to mention from the Sunday that appealed to you before we move on to IETF. If there's anything else that jumped out at you from the pretty packed agenda over the 2 days?
Yeah, there was. I will say that I really did enjoy Brett's talk. I thought it was really interesting to see behind the scenes about how stuff happens with GTLDs. It's kind of a thing that I don't think many people get a view into. So hearing about it was actually really interesting. And Brett is a great speaker. The other one was there was a talk about round trip times between resolvers and a root server, which was a lightning talk done by Paul Hoffman. And I thought the measurement technique was quite interesting. So they only have a limited amount of data to analyze because of, I think, privacy reasons. And they looked at the TTL header times in the IP packets, and were kind of estimating what the round trip, like more hops meant, or higher TTL meant, longer time. So it was really interesting to see that, I thought. Oh, by the way, I think it's worth saying that all the presentations are available publicly on the site. So the slides are up there now. You can go to the Indico DNS OARC page.
Yeah, you'll find in the sort of weekly headlines email, you'll see a link in there to the program, and within the program, the slides are embedded. When I checked this morning, none of the recordings were up, but no doubt that will change in the next couple of days, and there'll be links to the session recordings as well, so you can catch up on those, which obviously the size of the organization behind OARC is not of the scale of IETF, so it just takes a little bit longer to sort of mount the recordings on the site, but I'm sure before the end of this week they'll all be up. Okay, let's then move on to IETF, and I'll go through this perhaps in a little bit less detail, otherwise we'll be here till probably Friday to cover things off. Again, I've put up the slides that I used a couple of weeks ago just to sort of highlight some of the things that were coming up. So I'm not planning to go through all of these in great detail, and obviously on a personal level, I wasn't in all of these sessions because some of them were overlapping, so it would be quite difficult to be in more than one at a time, certainly in person. But of the ones that I went to, that I would sort of highlight are worth looking at the recordings for. I think OHI on the Tuesday, so the Oblivious HTTPS, and it did touch on Oblivious DO as well. So if you want the latest sort of developments on this, sort of generally on Oblivious, it's definitely worth dipping into the OHI session for that, and the recordings are up. I think for, if not all, then certainly the vast majority of the IETF slots now. If you go to the schedule, you'll see there's a link both to, I think they have the entirety of the schedule, is the first link, but the second link against each agenda item is just the recording of that slot. So you might find that it's a bit easier to use, rather than having to navigate a enormous volume of hours of material on YouTube. So just go to the individual links. So the high session definitely was worth attending. I think we had a very positive discussion at ADD, and that feels like there's substantive progress there. We had, for example, an update on Split Horizon, which I think was more positively received than it has been in the past. To my recollection, it didn't engender as much negativity from some participants as previously been the case. And then looking at the sort of deprive session, that also sort of picked up on some additional material as well. Although it sort of feels like the sort of deprive is looking to sort of not necessarily recharter, but certainly re-energize the focus of that working group, because they shared the same 2-hour slot, but so it didn't feel like there was a huge amount of content currently for the deprive working group. But before we move on, I don't know what other people made. So I think there'd be a number of people on this call that were in the in that particular session, so ADD and deprive. So any particular highlights from anyone else you want to chime in with? And don't forget to unmute if you want to. I see there's some packet loss on my end, which I just noticed, Kurt, so thank you for highlighting that. The joys of using the hotel's Wi-Fi, unfortunately, I don't think there's anything we can do about it, so hopefully it's not too terrible. No other comments?
We can understand you, but there's a bit of stuttering, but we can understand you.
Okay. So anything from anyone else that you sort of picked up from either OHI or the ADD and deprive in particular? Or shall I move on? Okay, let me move on. Looking at the Wednesday, don't recall any major highlights from the Wednesday that particularly stood out for me. On the various sessions, the plenary was quite good for different reasons, but again, I'll interrupt me if anyone's got any other highlights from the Wednesday, not necessarily from those that are listed on the slide, but indeed anything else that jumped out at you think is worth a mention. Otherwise, if I move on to the Thursday, I thought the two that I mentioned, the DNS Ops working group was if you want to, if you can only if you only had the time to watch one recording of one working group session, I would probably highlight the sort of DNS Ops as the one to go for. It had an awful lot of material that was covered in 2 hours. So in terms of value for your viewing sort of minutes, you'll definitely get good value from sort of dipping in on that one. It covered quite a lot of material. Including sort of good discussion on sort of various aspects of DNSSEC, and Dan, I think it was Dan, gave a presentation just updating where things are at with the sort of the structured error codes for DNS filtering, and how to use those, which previously had been quite contentious. With some people voicing the opinion that the IETF was endorsing internet censorship, which I think was a bit strong personally, but that didn't really come out this time, which was good. So it was quite a constructive presentation, but it did really just certainly for me remind me of the vast amount of content that the DNS Ops working group is covering at the moment. So the sort of 3 co-chairs are certainly doing well to stay on top of stuff, and did very well to navigate through all of that in their allotted 2 hours. I can see why normally I think DNS Ops tries to get 2 separate slots. I think there was more than enough material for that, were there to have been some additional time. The other one that I'll highlight is the decentralized internet infrastructure research group, which I've added that to what we had sort of put forward in our preview discussion as sessions worth attending. The reason why I've added that one on there is there was going to be a side meeting on centralization, but in the end, the DNRG chairs basically offered up time on the agenda on their research group session, so that the side meeting merged into the research group session. And from memory, I think there was only an hour slot, but I think at least half of it was devoted to talking about the effect, good or bad, of centralization. So given that normally policy discussions are frowned on in the IETF, because it's a research group, different rules apply. So if you want to just catch up on some thoughts on policy related matters, then the DNRG recording will certainly give you that. And it's quite a lively discussion, I think it's fair to say. But you know, in a sort of polite, constructive manner. So definitely worth looking at that one. And then moving on to the Friday, again, the one that I will highlight, literally the only one I'm going to highlight from the Friday, because I think overall content of the Friday felt a bit light. I think there could have been better use of the two sessions on the Friday, but there was the measurement and analysis of protocols, I think, research group. I think I can't remember what the map bit stands for, but there were a number of, because it's a 2-hour slot, there was various topics of interest in there, but the one that really captured the sort of attention of participants was a presentation titled "The Prevalence of Domain Name Encryption and Its Impact on Internet Filtering." But basically, it was suggesting that a combination of DNS encryption and ECH could collectively help to defeat internet censorship, which I think personally was a bit of a stretch. And it was presented by a PhD student from the University of Chicago. And I think the slides probably didn't do justice to the accompanying paper. So I think there's more nuance in the paper. The slides, if you like, gave fairly impactful headlines, but perhaps oversimplified some of the quite in-depth research that they've done. So I haven't had a chance yet to read the paper, but from some of the comments in the chat, the paper wasn't quite sort of black and white, if you will, as the slides suggested. But again, if certainly the discussion in the research group, and in particular in the chat, was particularly lively. So if you want to sort of dip into that one, that might give you a good laugh over lunchtime, just to see some of the toing and froing in that. So I'll say no more than that. But again, I don't know if anyone else attended that's on this call, and if so, if there's anything you want to say to that, or anything else from the IETF week that I've not mentioned.
Yeah, one thing I was going to mention, Andrew, and apologies if you've already mentioned this, I missed it because your connectivity is a bit up and down, but I thought it was interesting that there was a realization that although, there's a handful of DNS groups at the IETF, the DNS is getting mentioned in drafts that are appearing all over the place. And,
yes,
there was something like, I think they identified there was something like 50 or 60 drafts across the IETF currently that had DNS in them in some way, shape or form. And what they've done is decided to form a DNS executive and put a group of people together to review those drafts to make sure that they made at least some kind of sense from what they were doing from a DNS perspective. And I think this is something I might actually get involved with myself, actually.
Yeah, that's a good shout, Brett. I did mention that came up in the DNS Ops group. Warren mentioned that the newly or recreated DNS Directorate, apparently it's something which existed previously and has been resurrected. And in fact, from the list of papers that were put up in that group, which, as you say, was about 50, that list was pulled together because there was a mention of DNS either in the title or the abstract. And I think in reality, even some of the ADD papers, because they don't mention DNS explicitly in either the title or the abstract, I think there's some more papers in ADD alone beyond that, and I'm sure that means there's quite a few more spread across the rest of the IETF, where it's not so immediately obvious that there's a DNS reference, but it is in fact sort of picked up in the main body of the paper.
The last message to the DNS Directorate mailing list was in 2014.
Okay, so yeah, there you are then. So 8 years ago, when it was last active. So it's rising like a phoenix from the ashes. Yeah, good call. I'd forgotten about that, Brett. So that's useful to highlight. Right, let's just move on quickly, whilst hopefully the connection holds up on the hotel Wi-Fi. There wasn't a huge amount in the news this week that I was able to pick up on, but I thought it was an interesting piece from Alan Davis of Right Labs, in discussion with two others, Kieran McCarthy and Chris Buckridge, talking about internet governance. So for those of you that are more interested in policy stuff, you might want to catch up on that. It's a podcast, so yeah, you haven't got to read lots of stuff. You can just put your headphones on and listen. There's also an updated DNS tutorial for more tech-aware audience on the APNet blog, which you may find of interest. It talks about encrypted DNS amongst other things. And the only thing I picked up on, which was there was an article a few weeks ago using XDP to graph DNS metrics without having to touch the underlying DNS software. Well, there's a sort of part 2 of that, which was published a couple of days ago. So if that's your thing, there's additional information on that using the link you can see on the slide. In terms of future events, The ones I will highlight, because I've added them on to the forthcoming events list, the two at the bottom. IETF 116 will be in Yokohama. So that was announced during the IETF plenary middle of last week. And the second one, which wasn't actually announced, but I noticed was on the IETF site today, is that IETF 117, so this time next year, will be in San Francisco. So assuming that's not an error on the IETF website, you can start to plan your travels and maybe get some good priced flights if you book early, rather than pay the exorbitant rates at the last minute that you'd pay to cross the Atlantic at the moment. Perhaps more usefully, though, I'll also mention in terms of some upcoming workshops and conferences, there's a planned IAB workshop on management techniques in encrypted networks. That's due to take place, the actual workshop, which will be a virtual workshop in October, but the deadline for papers is coming up in the middle of August. And also RIPE 85, the deadline for papers is 21st August, even though the event itself again isn't until the towards the end of October. So just for your awareness, if you're interested in putting in papers for those.
Andrew, I can tell you without any doubt that deadline you've got there for UK Not 50 is definitely incorrect, because before this call, I was on the PC call for the UK Not, and actually the deadline is this week.
Oh, is it? Oh, okay. Maybe there was a typo when I was looking at it. Then okay, fine. In that case,
I think the meeting might be the 22nd of September.
Also, it is. Yes, that's a very good point. Yeah, don't leave it till the day of the meeting. That might not be ideal. Yeah, good spot. Yeah, fair enough. So yeah, there's another deadline looming on that as well. Then, so if you've got papers to submit, get them in soon. And don't start thinking about holidays just yet. Thanks for that, Brett. That's helpful. I've got a few things coming up to schedule in terms of future calls. Puneet will give me a date, I think, this week for the panel discussion. So he and Joe Crow are going to be the sort of two main sort of participants for the sort of learning from sort of deployment and scaling of encrypted resolvers. So you have Google and Comcast, who I suspect at the moment are probably managing the biggest volumes of encrypted data on resolvers on their respective services. Possibly, yeah, I think Comcast may well see more volume even than Cloudflare, because it's quite significant. I think it's in the billion, more than 1 billion queries a day that they're seeing. Also, Emily Davis from the DNS Research Foundation, she and I had a call a couple of weeks back. So she's going to join this call in the next few weeks to just explain what the Federation's all about, because I think that will be of interest to some of the people here, that you want to get involved in some of the stuff that Emily and team are doing. But you can hear that from her firsthand. And I will be adding to this list with a couple of presentations from IETF and OARC, just to sort of reprise those, and maybe with a chance for more discussion with the presenters on some of the content, to give a bit more depth on some of those papers. So expect an update on some of these in the next week or so. Right, and that's probably more than enough from me. So is there anything else that anyone else wants to mention, other than the connectivity here has got worse, so apologies for that. So last call for anything from anyone else who wants to chip in? No. Okay, in which case let's call it a day there. So I'd certainly commend some of the recordings here that we've talked about. Well worth looking at if you weren't in the sessions live, and to be fair, probably worth looking at even if you were, because it's easy to miss stuff when it's in real time. And other than that, have a great week, everyone. Those of us about to jump on planes, hopefully we'll have smooth flights back home, and see you all same time next week. So have a great week all.
Guys.
Thank you, Andrew, and have a safe trip home.
Thanks. Bye.